So what do we do? In the words of Winston Churchill, sometimes we have to do what is required. We must educate all of our people to an understanding of the arithmetic and the consequences of growth, especially in terms of populations and in terms of the Earth's finite resources. We must educate people to recognize the fact that growth of populations and growth of rates of consumption of resources cannot be sustained. Now, the world is full of people who are yakking about sustainability. Now, some of them are doing serious good things like trying to reduce energy consumption and things like this. Some of them are just trying to attack the word sustainability onto whatever they're doing, whether it's sustainable or not. We've got to understand the first law of sustainability, and it follows directly from what I've just been talking about. The first law of sustainability is this: population growth and/or growth in the rates of consumption of resources cannot be sustained. Now, this follows from the arithmetic of steady growth that we've spent time developing. So this isn't an opinion. Opinions are debatable. This is fact. There's nothing here to debate. You cannot sustain population growth. You cannot sustain growth in the rates of consumption of resources. And so it's intellectually dishonest to talk about sustainability without stressing the obvious fact that stopping population growth is a necessary condition for sustainability. Now, it's not sufficient. Stopping population growth in itself is not sufficient, but there's no way you can have sustainability if you don't stop population growth. We need to educate people to see the need to examine carefully the allegations of the technological optimists who assure us that science and technology will always be able to solve all of our problems of population growth, food, energy, and resources. Now, chief among these optimists was the late Dr. Julian Simon, formerly professor of economics and business administration at the University of Illinois and later at the University of Maryland. With regard to copper, Simon has written that we will never run out of copper because copper can be made from other metals. Well, the letters to the editor jumped all over him, told him about chemistry. He just brushed it off. He said, don't worry. If it's ever important, we'll figure out how to make copper out of other metals. Simon had a book that was published by the Princeton University Press, and in that book he's writing about oil from many sources, including biomass, and he says clearly, there's no meaningful limit to this source except for the sun's energy. He goes on to note, but even if our sun were not so vast as it is, there may well be other suns elsewhere. Simon's right. There are other suns elsewhere. But now the question is, would you base public policy on the belief that if we ever need another sun, we'll figure out how to go get it and haul it back into the solar system? Now don't laugh. For decades before his death, this man was a trusted policy advisor at the very highest levels in Washington, D.C. Here's a quotation from one of his strong supporters. There was a UN report that talked about the possibility of resource collapse because of population growth, and when asked about the report, HUD Secretary Jack Kemp said, nonsense, people are not a drain on the resources of the planet. Malcolm Forbes Jr., editor-in-chief of Forbes magazine, tells us in an editorial that CNN recently ran a silly series purporting to show that the world's in mortal danger because there are too many of us. In the poorer countries, the many mouths mean poverty, and richer countries are wrecking the Earth's atmosphere with pollution. It's all nonsense. Bill Moyers interviewed Isaac Asimov. He asked Asimov, what happens to the idea of the dignity of the human species if this population growth continues? And Asimov says it'll be completely destroyed. I like to use what I call my bathroom metaphor. If two people live in an apartment and the two bathrooms and both have freedom of the bathroom, you can go to the bathroom anytime you want, stay as long as you want for whatever you need, and everyone believes in freedom of the bathroom. It should be right there in the Constitution. But if you have 20 people in the apartment and two bathrooms, then no matter how much every person believes in freedom of the bathroom, there's no such thing. You have to set up times for each person. You have to bang on the door, aren't you through yet, and so on. And Asimov concluded with what I think is one of the most profound observations I've seen in years. Asimov says, in the same way, democracy cannot survive overpopulation. Human dignity cannot survive overpopulation. Convenience and decency cannot survive overpopulation. As you put more and more people into the world, the value of life not only declines, it disappears. It doesn't matter if someone dies. The more people there are, the less one individual matters. Now let me give you two examples of this destruction of democracy by population growth. I joined the faculty here in 1950. At that time, the population of Boulder was about 20,000. There were 9 members of the city council. Today it's approaching 100,000. There are 9 members of the city council. So in a little over 50 years, the number of people per member of the city council has increased by a factor of 5. Democracy in Boulder has declined to 20% of what it was 50 years ago. And the second example has to do with the year 2000 national census. This showed that in the decade of the 90s, the U.S. population increased by about 13%. Now this means every House seat in the House of Representatives now has 13% more constituents on the average than they did 10 years ago. And in the last 1 hour, the world population has increased by about 10,000 people, and the population of the United States in this 1 hour has increased by about 280 people. And we have to ask, why don't more U.S. environmentalists and environmental organizations speak out about the problem of population growth here in the United States? The simple arithmetic makes it absolutely clear that long-term preservation of the environment in the U.S. is impossible in the face of continued U.S. population growth. But you hear all sorts of political leaders say, oh, we can have our growth, we'll call it smart growth, and smart growth will save the environment. Well, we need to know about smart growth. Smart growth destroys the environment. Dumb growth destroys the environment. Now, smart growth just destroys the environment with good taste. So it's a little like buying a ticket on the Titanic. If you're smart, you go first class. If you're dumb, you go steerage, but the result's the same. So central to the things that we must do is to recognize that population growth is the immediate cause of all of our resource and environmental crises. And of all the crises, I think this one, global warming, looms larger and more threatening than anything in all of human history. Now, because of our enormous per capita consumption of resources, we can say with confidence, the world's worst population growth problem is right here in the United States. But you hear all sorts of well-meaning people pointing to distant underdeveloped nations and saying they're the problem with overpopulation. The average person in the United States in a lifetime will consume something like maybe 30 times the amount of resources that'll be consumed by a person in a lifetime in an underdeveloped nation. We are the problem. We have the responsibility, and we have the authority to deal with the problem here as a domestic problem in the United States. And some years ago, speaking here on the campus of the University of Colorado, our United States Senator Tim Wirth said that the best thing we can do to help other countries stop their population growth is for us to set an example and stop our own population growth here in the U.S. We have sent representatives to international conferences to tell the underdeveloped nations, you're the problem, you've got to stop your population growth. And they just laugh and say, look, you're the problem with all of your high per capita consumption. Now, except for the petroleum graphs, the things I tell you are not predictions of the future. I'm only reporting facts and the results of some very simple arithmetic. But I do this with confidence that these facts, this arithmetic, and more important, our level of understanding of them will play a major role in shaping our future. Now, don't take what I've said blindly or uncritically because of the rhetoric or for any other reason. Please, you check the facts. Please check my arithmetic. If you find errors, please let me know. But if you don't find errors, then I hope you'll take this very, very seriously. You are important people. You can think. And if there was ever a time when the human race needs people who will think, it's right now. It's our responsibility as citizens in a democracy to think. And so to be successful with this experiment of human life on Earth, we have to understand the laws of nature as we encounter them in the study of science and mathematics. We have to remember the message of this cartoon. Thinking is very upsetting. It tells us things we'd rather not know. We should remember the words of Galileo. He said, "I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with sense, reason, and intellect has intended us to forego their use." We should remember the words of Aldous Huxley. He observed that facts do not cease to exist because they're ignored. And we should remember H.L. Mencken's social philosophy. He believed that it was in the nature of the human species to reject what is true but unpleasant and to embrace what is obviously false but comforting. And we should remember Eric Severide's law. He was a newscaster who made the transition from radio to television back in the 1950s. He observed that the chief source of problems is solutions. Now let's just look at an example. The Nile River for thousands of years would flood in the spring, and the silt that was carried down by the river would be deposited on agricultural lands on the two sides of the river, and this renewed the fertility of the land. They had a sustainable agriculture for thousands of years. But now the flood was kind of a nuisance as you had cities develop along there, and the city people didn't like the floods, and then the city people needed electricity. So that was the problem. What was the solution? The high dam at Aswan. So now let's look at the problems caused by the solution. First of all the silt is carried down by the river, is deposited in the reservoir behind the dam. So this means the dam has a lifetime, maybe 100 to 200 years. It certainly is not very long. So it'll be filled, and then there won't be the storage capacity that it was designed to have. The water that's let out from the dam today is very clear water. So this means all of the erosion patterns downstream have changed. It used to be deposit here, pick up there, and so on. Now it's pretty much just picking up because it starts out from the dam as clear water. Down at the delta in Alexandria, where the Nile enters the Mediterranean Sea, they're washing away agricultural land because it's no longer being deposited and the river is just washing it out into the Mediterranean. And it used to be the load of biological nutrients that were brought down in this river all the time supported a major fishery in the eastern Mediterranean. That fishery is in serious decline because the nutrients no longer reach there. And now, in order to have their agriculture, they've got to do irrigation. They've got to buy fertilizer. It takes energy to make the fertilizer, and it could easily be that some of the energy to make the fertilizer comes from the dam. And now there are lots of more agricultural workers wading barefoot in the irrigation ditches, and they're subject to a schistomiasis, which is some kind of a parasite that's carried by things in the water that can get through the skin. And if you're barefoot in the water, why you can get this. Everything went bad because of the solution to the problem. Nobody looked at what the problems would be caused by the solution. This is one of the most important things that we need to remember. Now, here's a challenge. Can you think of any problem on any scale, from microscopic to global, whose long-term solution is in any demonstrable way aided, assisted, or advanced by having larger populations at the local level, at the state level, the national level, or globally? Can you think of anything that will get better if we crowd more people into our communities, into our state, into our nation, or on this earth? Think about it. Will anything get better with increased population? And I like the words of the late Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr. He said, unlike the plagues of the Dark Ages or contemporary diseases, which we do not yet understand, the modern plague of overpopulation is soluble by means we have discovered and with resources we possess. What is lacking is not sufficient knowledge of the solution, but universal consciousness of the gravity of the problem and the education of the billions who are its victims. And so I hope I've made a reasonable case for my opening statement that I believe the greatest shortcoming of the human race is our inability to understand this very simple arithmetic. So I thank you very, very much. and I'd be happy to answer questions.